Thank you all for joining us again. We're going to go ahead and start. I'm Chris Neidl. I'm one of the co-founders of the OpenAir Collective. And this is sort of a special episode of our regular This is CDR webinar, which is hosted by Toby Bryce and Megha Raghavan. You've heard allusion in past episodes to a legislative project that was under development that's focused on carbon dioxide removal. So we're incredibly excited right now that we're able to actually finally give you some details about that policy, which is going to be introduced in New York State. And you're going to hear from Assemblymember Patricia Fahy, who's our champion and sponsor for that. But before we do that, we'll give an overview of the policy, the background on it, where it came from, what the legislation is going to do. And what's also of great interest is while we're getting the ball rolling here in New York State, which we're extremely happy about, we already have efforts underway in multiple states to see versions of this similar policy introduced, with New York leading the way. So the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act is a legislative proposal that was developed by OpenAir members over the last several months, led by our member Toby Bryce, Jamie Rogers, and others. So today we're excited to finally unbox it, because we're now at the point where it's actually going to go from concept into legislation, thanks to Assemblymember Fahy. Just a little bit of a background. I was looking at the RSVP list, and I know that many folks on the call are part of the OpenAir community or regular attendees of This is CDR weekly webinars. But for those of you who are new to the collective, we're a global volunteer network, entirely volunteer, that's dedicated to advancing carbon dioxide removal. And we have projects that are both focused on citizen science and collaborative research that our members do. But a big part of what we do is also focused on developing and advocating for legislation and policies that will be able to drive forward CDR at the state and local level. We're a Discord-based community, for those of you who are familiar with, and we'll send you a little link at the end that will allow you to join it if you're interested. It's kind of like Slack. It's an online platform. We kicked that off in February 2020, a little over a year and a half ago. And now we're actually inching towards about 500 members. We got started in New York, but now we're a global network. We have members on 5 different continents contributing to what we do, which is really exciting. And everything that we do, what we call missions, and the Carbon Removal Leadership Act is an example of that. These are specific goal-oriented projects that are advancing carbon removal in some different way. They're entirely conceived, led, and directed by our members. And again, as I mentioned, a big part of that is policy advocacy. We got our first bill introduced about a year and a half ago in New York. A version of that passed in June. That bill spread to other states. And currently, in addition to CRLA, there's 3 other pieces of legislation that we're trying to advance in some shape or form in different states, including in Europe. And so what we're going to talk about today is this specific Carbon Removal Leadership Act, which we're incredibly excited about. And today our goal is to really get into the details of that and then get your input, ideas, and feedback on the project. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my co-presenter and CRLA mission co-lead, Megha Raghavan, who's going to run us through a high-level overview of carbon dioxide removal. Megha?
Cool, thanks. All right, so just to start off with what we're talking about. So carbon dioxide removal is really about all kinds of activities that remove CO2 from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in products. And the reason why we think this is so imperative is that if you look at, all the most credible climate models out there, including the IPCC report that came out recently, any pathway that keeps us to below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, as the commonly agreed on goal of Paris and other agreements, is one that would require carbon dioxide removal to happen in this century. And you can see that on this chart on the left, that if we continue with business as usual, quite an overshoot of the goals that we need to have. Even to get to below 2 degrees Celsius, we need to have some kind of negative emissions coming into play. And this is where carbon removal kind of comes into the picture. We've also heard from multiple respected researchers and scientists that carbon dioxide removal is going to be essential to get down to net zero. So if you think about what net zero really means, there's a certain amount of reductions that can happen, and that absolutely does need to happen. And that's going to be a huge part of getting us down to net zero. But to get to an actual zero or negative scenario, you will need to have some amount of carbon dioxide removal come into play. And we've seen that governments are moving forward on this little by little, but really it's gone relatively slowly. And when you think about the scale and the speed of things that we're going to need to actually achieve something like 1.5 degrees or less of warming, so far things have just moved far too slowly. One analogy that I think is super helpful to understand what's going on is the bathtub analogy. So you can think of the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere as a bathtub where all of the activities that we do that cause emissions are slowly filling up the bathtub more and more over time. And now to get down and sort of start reversing that problem, it's not enough to just turn off the tap and just wait. We really do need to actually pull the plug and sort of start actually draining some of these emissions away. And that's what carbon dioxide removal can actually start to do. So thinking about the policy context that we're operating in, obviously this is different in different states, different countries, but it is starting to happen where states and countries are enacting net zero targets at some date in the future. And with that, thinking about reaching net zero, estimates have shown that about 10 to 15% of existing emissions are going to be difficult or slow or inequitable to abate. So essentially that will leave a certain amount of carbon dioxide continuing to be emitted, and to really get down to net zero, that needs to be addressed with carbon dioxide removal on a gigaton scale. There's currently no real policy commitments to actually incorporating CDR into their emission strategies and targets that we've set. It's maybe implicit in some of the targets that have been set out, but at the end of the day, there's no real explicit commitment to address the 10 to 15% that we've talked about through, robust mechanisms of using CDR. And states in the US in particular really have a lot of power to individually and together lead these CDR efforts and scale up the industry of providing CDR, start to drive down costs to a point where, individual businesses and things like that can actually think about purchasing CDR. So that's why we've sort of started focusing at the state level. We also really believe that those states that act early on this are going to seize a huge economic opportunity. There's been estimates of this carbon tech industry being a multi-trillion-dollar one. And states who move fast on this and enact the right policies and enact, favorable policies to get CDR kickstarted are going to capture that by bringing in those businesses to their states. And so that's really where the Carbon Removal Leadership Act comes into play. So when we think about how to sort of move CDR forward, what we want to leverage here is the power of procurement. And in particular, public procurement, which is a really great tool to drive forward innovation. Beyond kind of just bringing these solutions to market, we can actually start to create demand for carbon dioxide removal, which helps to get companies that provide this off the ground and sort of gives them a market to start selling into with significant government demand. And this basically means by enacting the kinds of policies we're talking about, we can scale up adoption, so create a market for CDR to start selling into. When we think about the scale of this as well, government really has a really strong kind of arsenal to play with this, because the scale of government procurement is so much higher than, say, venture capital or anything else. Government procurement amounts to about 12% of global GDP, which is obviously huge, and is about $11 trillion a year when compared to about $300 billion in venture capital funding. So it's really orders of magnitude above something like venture capital, and that's really what it takes to create this market and start driving it forward. And starting to buy at this scale is going to have a huge effect on driving down costs, which is a really important part of what we're hoping to do in the early years here. CDR technologies are obviously very new and need to start scaling up and learning by doing to start driving their costs down to a point where it can be more widely procured by other types of entities. The other great thing about this is that by starting off as the main adopter and main procurer of this, governments can ensure that we create standards, validate the solutions, and factor in equity and justice considerations. So, really starting this market off in a way that takes those factors into account and actually sort of rewards companies that do these things well, so that becomes industry standard and becomes the norm as the industry starts to scale up. There is already pretty good precedent for this concept of procuring CDR. Stripe, Microsoft, and Shopify are three companies that have seen that CDR is going to become necessary and important and have made themselves early adopters, committing significant amounts of money towards procuring CDR despite, potentially high costs, whatever else. They're basically committing to the idea of procuring CDR at whatever cost might be necessary from companies that they think are promising to start kickstarting the industry. And the policy itself has been conceived, researched, and drafted entirely by OpenAir members. So, Toby and Chris, as well as many others, Jamie was mentioned as well. And so we've obviously done that with help from a lot of researchers, people in the business of providing CDR, legislators, et cetera. But this is a ground up policy that our members have developed to do something that we think is really important. And we're hoping to essentially integrate CDR procurement targets with existing net zero targets that states may already have. New York, which Toby is going to talk a little bit more about, has some legislation in place that already specifies net zero targets. California is starting to put some in place as well. So we want to really plug into those and build CRLA to make sense for the states that each iteration will actually operate in. And the great thing about working with this in a sort of grassroots way is that we really have the power to adapt this to match different state contexts, the opportunity that might be at hand in different states. We have our members in different states thinking about what makes sense for their state, working with the legislators or working with people in that state to really understand the right context, and then adapting the core principles of CRLA to that context. We started off with New York, as I mentioned, where there's already some great legislation in place with net zero targets and other things that kind of make CRLA possible and kind of lay the groundwork. In 2022, we're hoping to expand that to California and Colorado, and we're already having great conversations with people in those states to get that started. And then here, there's a few other states as well where we're relatively early on, but we see a lot of promise, both in terms of members in OpenAir who are excited to take this forward, as well as getting legislators or other people in the state excited about potentially introducing this as well.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Megan, for the background. We'll actually get into that and Toby will present, but I think this is a good opportunity before Toby gets into the nuts and bolts of how the policy works. I didn't know if we wanted to return to you, Assemblymember Fahy, if you wanted to make any sort of statements to help sort of frame the details that we're about to propose and as the sponsor of the bill in New York.
Sure. First of all, let me say again, Chris and the whole team, thank you for your amazing volunteer work. Your leadership and for reaching out. I'm really proud to do this, and you're teaching me a little bit as well. I've got and I still have a learning curve, but I'm just thrilled because I often say, as I've backed all sorts of different environmental and energy or climate change related legislation, I often say I do not think we can be aggressive enough. And this bill is aggressive. But again, as I said, I think there's good news that just happened in this past week. We've been working on this bill for, I think, a couple of months now with you. But just yesterday, the president signed the infrastructure package, which will include funding for carbon reduction. So I think that's terrific. In the meantime, we love when New York leads. So we want to see New York be in a position on this, although we welcome that healthy competition from California, Washington, and all the other states you named. But the bottom line here is it's not enough. We all talk about reducing CO2 emissions and finding more efficiencies with what we are doing now, but it's not enough. And I do think what you are advocating and what we hope to introduce in the next couple of weeks here is removing carbon from the atmosphere, especially its legacy carbon. And I love the bathtub description, but not, again, it's also, I should also add that it's not enough for us to just talk about reducing, but it's also not enough for us to talk about this as an offset. And that's something we try to make very clear in the bill. This is not an offset for, as we've talked about in the past, and offsets have been very, very controversial. But the bottom line is we know by the middle of this century, we should be removing billions of tons of carbon. And we also have seen through other initiatives with acid rain and others, when we do public investments, it helps to stimulate the public-private innovation. And we've seen that on so many issues. So we think a public investment here is really critical. We're working on a couple of financing mechanisms on how we can find monies for this. But we also know that the more we stimulate that innovation, it will drive down the cost, just as we've seen on electric vehicles, right? The more companies getting in, the more the research and innovation, the costs of electric vehicles is finally coming down. So government, the priming the pump, if you will, truly does help, and procurement can really make a difference. We are actively reaching out to a couple of different senators and actively looking for a good offset on the funding to help pay for this. But I think there's a growing recognition that it's not enough to just reduce. we actually have to move toward removal. And I also look forward to hearing more about the federal dollars. I hope that helps, and I look more from hearing from each of you, but again, an honor to work with each of you.
Yeah, an honor to work with you too, Assembly Member. I want to just commend you and your staff who, as we started talking about this, got into the real fine policy details and really thought about this with great scrutiny and added a lot to our own thinking on the bill. And so I just want to commend you for your vision and courage for introducing what really is I think, a policy whose time has come. And, you know, we reached out to you, not just because the smartest people in New York State come from Albany, which you and I both know, but also because you've been a champion of, you know, really at the forefront of the climate legislation that's really defined New York as a global leader, but also a champion for labor, for workers, and for economic development upstate. And that is a huge part of this, as Toby will get into. So we could not be more excited about having you as our champion in the Assembly to get this rolling. So thank you so much for taking the time.
And just quickly, Chris, thank you as well. And thanks for the shout out to my team, Jake Egloff, Michelina, Alex, everybody, and Alyssa. Everybody's been involved. We have a small but mighty team, and really committed to working on this, because we do think that this is the type of public investment that's needed, and we all want to meet. But by the way, those who supported our climate leadership goals that were adopted 2 years ago, whether they supported or opposed them, everybody agreed they were ambitious. And we know that we cannot meet those ambitious goals without doing something dramatic like removing carbon. And I'll stop there and look forward to hearing more from Toby too.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member. And yeah, we'll bring Toby in right now, who again, I want to give a big shout out to, because it was really his idea really that launched this, and then the process through which we interviewed probably about 50 subject experts in academia and industry. He led that process, and that resulted in what we think is an excellent policy. So Toby, if you want to go ahead and proceed, and you can give us a bit of a breakdown of how the policy actually works.
Absolutely. And I would like to echo Chris's thanks to the Assembly Member for your leadership and for being here with us today, and also your team. I mean, they're fantastic, and I look forward to working with them to get this introduced and passed. Okay. All right. So an important foundation for the bill is, as the Assembly Member has referenced, New York's landmark climate bill from 2019 called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So this bill sits kind of inside that bill, and that bill is very much the context that we're going to be talking about here today. And that bill, as we already mentioned, I mean, decarbonization of the economy and emissions reductions must come first. And that bill mandates that 85% of, the bill mandates net zero by 2050, 85% of which is to be achieved by emissions reductions and decarbonization of the economy. The bill is based on a 1990 emissions baseline of 410 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So 85% of that is to be achieved by decarbonization of power, transportation, building sectors, food systems, et cetera. That leaves 15% of quote unquote hard to abate emissions. And as the Assembly Member referenced, there is some language in the bill that talks about offsets, but the offsets are not well defined, and they're not net zero aligned, meaning that if you emit a ton, you have to remove a ton. So what this bill does is basically say, if you're going to emit a ton of that 15%, we need to remove it from the atmosphere and not anything else, not emissions avoidance, not renewable energy credits, but actual hard carbon removals. And so that's where this bill comes in. Policy elements. So the bill is based on a competitive CDR procurement model via a capped reverse auction, which we think is a pretty innovative policy feature. EDF recently wrote a very great paper about how a reverse auction via public procurement can help drive down the cost of direct air capture. This bill is more general to all CDR pathways, but it's the same idea. Use competition managed by the government to drive down the cost of these necessary technologies. It's also really important to say up front that the bill is centered on equity, environmental justice, and delivering benefit to disadvantaged communities, just as the CLCPA is. One of the important things that needs to happen before New York starts procuring CDR under this bill is a survey of the state that studies all of the CDR pathways, which we'll get into in a second, that have megaton, meaning million ton potential, and also how those pathways affect local communities. both the benefits and any potential harms. And there's a specific prescription that environmental justice communities and disadvantaged communities, which are defined in the CLCPA as the communities that have sort of borne the brunt of the fossil economy over the past century and the harm that it's caused, that they are included in this process, that they're interviewed, that their opinions are sought, and most importantly, that their opinions are factored into the policy. So really important up front to talk about that. The bill is not specific in terms of what carbon dioxide removal pathways are procured, meaning it's not saying you have to buy direct air capture or you have to buy soil carbon. It's standards-based, which we'll get into in a second, but we really want to leverage innovation and competition so that all of the exciting things that are happening in New York with respect to carbon tech, which again, we'll talk about in a second, can factor into what is delivered here. So the standards that we're talking about, these are really based on the great work of Oxford principles over in England, and also Carbon Plan based in on the west coast of the US. But the CDR procured under the bill needs to be additional, meaning that any project would not have occurred without the legislation. It needs to be permanent. We have a durability threshold of 100 years in the legislation. And we'll talk about in a second how CDR that's more durable will be favored during the procurement process, but there's a baseline of 100 years. The CDR also must have really ironclad measurement, reporting, and verification, MRV, via some third party that's acceptable to the department, which in the bill is the department that administers the CLCPA is the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York. So they will have the leverage to decide what kind of MRV to use, but the bill requires that there's widely accepted third-party MRV of any CDR projects that are procured under the bill. And then finally, and this is in a different color box again, because it's so important, equitable. The CDR that's procured under the bill needs to make sure that it's delivering positive social and economic benefits to the community level and not delivering harms. So that's going to be a really important part of what's happening as well. Couple of this is just samples of, again, the bill does not prescribe what CDR pathways the state will be procuring, but these are just examples that are being researched, developed, and deployed in New York State. There's amazing work being done with soil carbon up at Cornell, for example, employing ground up basalt and spreading it on croplands. This will allow agricultural communities to take advantage of some of the benefits of this bill and also deliver amazing climate benefit as well in terms of drawing carbon dioxide down from the atmosphere. Biochar, there's a tremendous amount of innovation and research being done on biochar in New York at RIT, Upstate, SUNY ESF, Cornell again, including at Cornell biochar from dairy, so from cow manure, which basically dairy is a big industry in New York, and this will be a way to A, help decarbonize that industry, and B, deliver some of the benefits from this bill to those communities. Direct air capture, which is machines that draw carbon dioxide down from the atmosphere. There is tremendous amount of innovation happening in New York State with ocean carbon capture, including some great research by a professor named Matt Eisenman at Stony Brook University. It's called CMATE, and it's deacidifying the ocean and drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. And then there are a couple of biomass-based pathways, and then the carbon dioxide, many of these has to be sequestered, and there's a great opportunity to sequester CO2 in concrete in New York State. And there is in the midterm great research being done at Columbia University by Dr. Dave Goldberg about how we can sequester CO2 offshore and deposits that happen to coincide with offshore wind development in New York. So that's a great economic potential benefit for those communities. So this is we're a special episode of This is CDR, but the whole point of the This is CDR series that we've been putting on is to help contextualize these solutions and talk about them and how they might play into this policy and how they might be able to deliver benefits into New York. So there are all of these, there's a link in the chat to all the past sessions. I think this is the 13th or the 14th one. And many of the pathways that we just discussed are explained in detail in these sessions. So down to the nuts and bolts of the policy. So basically the procurement scales up annually starting in 2025 and finishing in 2050 when New York is mandated to achieve net zero. The auction cap decreases as volumes increase. So we're leveraging competition driven by the reverse auction and innovation to get the price down. And we say from 0 to 60, 61.5 million tons is 15% of that 1990 baseline of 410 million tons. So the policy starts with the state procuring 100,000 tons in 2025. And initially it doubles year on year, and then the slope decreases a bit eventually. So we get to 61.5 million tons in 2050. 5-year initial authorization. The bill would be quite expensive over its 25 years, but it starts small. So the first 5 years, the cost is fairly modest. As Assemblymember Fahy mentioned, the bill is fully paid for. There's a concept of carbon removal fee that's created in the legislation. That's basically an extended producer responsibility fee on the hard to abate emission sources as defined in the CLCPA. We haven't gotten all of we're still fine tuning the funding mechanism for the initial 5-year authorization, but we're gonna focus on a non-regressive fee on hard to abate emission sources. Assemblymember Fahy's team is really fantastic about working out these details. So we should have that buttoned up hopefully fairly soon. So Mega talked about some of the benefits of a procurement policy. I mean, there are other ways to do this. California has a compliance mechanism called the low carbon fuel standard, where the actual emitters are buying the credits. We decided that we really wanted to focus on a procurement policy because it would allow for more control and allow for the factoring of additional benefits besides price. We also feel like it will allow us to get to a higher quality of carbon dioxide removal projects and pathways, as opposed to just leaving it to the market. A procurement policy can factor in-state to create jobs and industrial development. We talked about environmental justice and equity, which is obviously very important. There are all sorts of, many of these pathways offer really compelling ecosystem and agricultural co-benefits. And so a procurement policy can factor those in as well. And the bill actually creates a specific scorecard that the department is to use at its discretion. The department can decide how to weight these different factors, but there's an actual scorecard in the bill that directs the department. These are the things that you need to consider, and then the department will have the discretion on how to weigh them and balance them. So that's about it. That's the nuts and bolts of the policy. Again, it's really important that the policy is centered on environmental justice and equity, just because the fossil economy did not do a good job of this at all and delivered a lot of negative externality and harm to disadvantaged communities. So as we move to a decarbonized future, it's really important that we take extra steps to make sure that, that we're not doing that. So, and delivering benefits to disadvantaged communities. As we mentioned, it started in New York. That's where we wrote the policy. That's where, you know, we are the first place that it's going to be introduced. But we have a lot of progress already in states like California, Massachusetts, Colorado. We plan for it to be a multi-state mission in 2022. OpenAir is all about open source, citizen sourced viral policy development. And, you know, it's entirely possible that the policy is very applicable to any framework. So you just have to figure out what the local environment is and tweak it so that it fits in with whether it's a net zero policy or if there's no net zero policy, but it's definitely a policy mechanism that can work worldwide. Here's a link. There should be a link in the chat. If you want to get involved with us in the very near term, we are going to need help in New York. You know, we're going to have a Senate sponsor very soon, we hope. And Assemblymember Fahy is going to be introducing it into the New York State Assembly, but we would love to have more OpenAir people calling their local representatives and asking them to support the bill. That's how I personally got involved in OpenAir a year or so ago. I contacted my local representative in North Brooklyn, Joe Lenthal, and said, hey, can you support the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act? He did sign on and kind of connected with OpenAir that way. And so it's a great way to get involved. And I'm sure the Assembly member will agree that our representatives love to hear from their local constituents about what's important to them. So that's a great way to move the bill forward. So please sign up for OpenAir and get involved with us, and we'd love to get your help.
Can I piggyback very quickly onto that comment? We also need some other environmental groups, energy groups, and EJ groups. So those of you involved as volunteers or otherwise with any other groups, there are so many out there, but including the New York League of Conservation Voters, the ACE, the Alliance for Clean Energy. There's just a whole host of the environmental advocates. We've talked to a couple of them, but those are the kind of groups that if they start talking about this, that's how we really get this conversation to snowball. And they also have some great relationships with a whole host of other elected members. So this is, as I mentioned, there was a learning curve for me. I know there's a learning curve for a lot of others, yet there is an interest. And, I think we have a new governor that is showing all indications that she as well is committed to these leadership goals, the climate goals that we adopted 2 years ago. So we have also going to be reaching out there as well. So, but that's where we really need the help, is talking this up with other groups. So thank you so much on that, Toby. And the rest.
Just one note on that, we do have a draft support memo that we've started to circulate. If you're on the call and you work with one of these organizations, we'd love to talk to you about it. We in fact have a call this week with New York LCV. So we are getting on that, and we'd love to talk to anyone on the call who's in that call. I see a couple questions from Matt from NYSERDA. One, a quick answer to your purchase agreement. There's a lot left to the discretion of the department, but currently in the bill, there's a 10-year delivery period. So there's annual procurement with a 10-year delivery period.
Yeah, and there are some other good questions that are coming through the chat there, but just want to really stress even more is that, this is, again, as we've described, is come out of a grassroots volunteer network with input from a whole host of different experts and folks in industry, as well as other organizations. The process of trying to get the other coalition members to join is underway, being driven by our members. With our LECLA bill, which passed in June, we were able to put together a coalition of 30 different organizations that spanned a whole range of different sectors, as well as environmental advocates. So just stressing what Toby said there, we'll be reaching out to you, but don't wait for us. Certainly reach out to us. Versions of the presentation that we're giving today, we will give it any day of the week to try to clarify not only how the policy works, but to continue to get ideas from different stakeholders and hopefully future members of the coalition. So consider yourself invited to the coalition, and we look forward to getting that effort going. The session starts in January. And we have till June, but between now and then, we're going to be very active having these conversations with both organizations and legislators. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, but one thing I wanted Toby and Mega, if we could just first stress, is one thing that understandably there's confusion about, because when people hear words like capture and carbon removal, there's often a sort of a confusion or a conflation with technologies that are integrated with large polluting industries like fossil fuels and that capture carbon from the point source and then do something with it. That's not what we're talking about here. So Toby, I didn't know if you wanted to just quickly put a sort of a finer point on that, because I think that's education item number one, is making that distinction.
Yeah, so carbon removal, carbon dioxide removal, is actually one way or another drawing carbon dioxide down from the atmosphere. Point source capture, what's commonly called carbon capture, is capturing CO2 at the point of emission. So it's an emissions reduction. So at a concrete plant or a natural gas power plant or a coal plant or what have you. And so that's great, but that goes into the emissions reductions bucket and not the removal bucket. And so it is not net zero aligned to offset a ton of emissions with a ton of emissions reduction, because a ton is still going into the atmosphere. So you need to offset the ton of emissions with a removal.
Great. And so we do have some really good questions that are starting to come in, and we can certainly get to all of them. We are tacking a little bit of extra time into the session because we had a bit of a late start. I'm just going to go from kind of top to bottom here, but we got a question from Liam St. Louis. So I want to give a shout out to Liam's with the Carbon Gap team, an excellent organization that just launched in Europe that's going to be fighting the good fight in Europe. So congrats to Liam and the team on that. But his question is there anything that helps proactively develop the MRV for pathways that don't yet have it? I know that's kind of a subject of interest for you, Toby. I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
The short answer is no. I think that the actual market support will implicitly help develop MRV. But we were advised by basically everyone else that we talked to who's in the procurement business to not get the state of New York into the business of MRV and doing LCAs, but rather evaluating the MRVs and the LCAs that are presented. So there's nothing explicitly in the bill to how New York via this program would contribute to that. If you have a specific idea of language or a concept that might be worth introducing, we'd love to hear it. But we were advised to kind of to basically have the state be a buyer here and a market support and not market making, I would say. So there is an early stage CDR market that, as Mega referenced, has been started primarily by companies like Stripe, Shopify, and Microsoft. And the idea would be for New York and hopefully many other states and jurisdictions to start contributing to the buy side of that market.
Yeah, and I think that one important thing to just tack onto that last thought, Toby, is that we were greatly influenced by this private sector leadership from the companies that you mentioned. I think another one I just read about today. So that's incredibly important alone in aggregation. But what we're excited about, particularly states like New York that are large states, large economies, climate forward states, where some of what are considered the supply challenges right now, that there's not a lot of high quality carbon dioxide removal to buy. With a project like this that starts in 2025 and ramps up, New York alone, particularly with other states, can really start to make whole projects happen by signaling that kind of demand and sort of, I think, start to address some of the shortages that we see in supply of CDR. So that's exciting. We have some kind of technical questions, which the legislation by design, you don't fully prescribe what are ultimately the fine points of rulemaking, but some of the things are already in the draft that we've created. And one was just about the structuring of the purchase agreements for bids that are selected. This question came from Matt. So, how are the purchase agreements structured, or how might they be? Getting capital intensive projects built often requires long-term to 10 to 20-year periods, offtake agreements in order to obtain financing. So we've been thinking a lot about this, obviously. It's not necessarily spelled out in detail in the bill, but Toby and Mega, I don't know if we wanted to share a little bit what we're sort of thinking about in terms of the timescales and offtake agreements for this.
I think Toby touched on it a little bit, but thinking about having a 10-year delivery term for each year's worth of purchases so that companies do have the time to sort of plan that capacity and scale it up if there's sort of a CapEx requirement up front. That's something we've discussed, I think, with people who are involved in CDR companies, trying to get the right numbers around that. So procurement every year to kind of set a volume of removals that we think is right for that year, but then delivery over a bit of a longer term to actually make that a little more feasible for the people who have to deliver it.
And in the New York bill, one preference on the procurement scorecard is time of delivery. So CDR that could be delivered sooner would get a preference. Again, like how the preference is factored will be left to the discretion of the department, in this case, DEC, presumably. But yeah, the 10-year delivery period. And keep in mind, I mean, we, as Chris mentioned, we talked to dozens and dozens of folks, including entrepreneurs on the CDR supply side. And we got all sorts of reactions about the price and the scale and everything else. We're starting at 100,000 tons in 2025. And on the one hand, the entire world delivered maybe 50,000 tons of CDR in 2021, or will deliver permanent durable CDR. So that's a pretty aggressive number. On the other hand, if we have to get to if the world can get to gigaton scale by mid-century, we need to get started. So we tried to get a happy medium between what's possible and practical and where we need to be in decades from now.
Great. And Assemblymember Fahy has just notified that she is jumping off the call, but before you do, I just again want to give you
thank you, Assemblymember.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Really excited to work with you.
Well.
Yeah. Just a couple of other points. We have one thing I want to stress too, which was alluded to a bit in the presentation, but it's worth noting that not only does New York State have, really the sort of the high standard with our Climate Protection and Community Leadership Act, but New York has made some real moves that are unique in the world, I think, in terms of really trying to focus on carbon tech and carbon removal. We have a number of university and private research projects that are going on that have received funding from the DOE more than any other state, actually. We did look at that. The state has also put funding in to support entrepreneurs that are in the CDR and carbon tech space, as well as researchers, which a level that is, I think, quite unique, certainly in the North American context. We have the Carbon to Value Accelerator, which I believe was the first of its kind in the world. It's a entrepreneurship accelerator program specifically for carbon tech, which was a project of NYSERDA's and Greentown Labs, anchored in Brooklyn. So that's really exciting. So there's a lot that's going on in New York that we think this is all of a piece with. You know, we've got these great supply side policies that are in place, but to really ramp up and to capture the mantle, I think in New York, we need a demand policy, and that's what we're proposing here. So I think that this really clicks in with things that are already happening on the ground.
I just want to add a shout out to NYSERDA for concepting and administering all of these amazing programs. I mean, tens of millions of dollars have gone into the innovation front and the R&D front. And there's a brand new one that came out, I guess, a week or so ago, and I'm going to get the name wrong, but the Carbon Tech Entrepreneurial Fellowship that brings in one of the most amazing accelerators in the CDR space, Activate, to New York City with Columbia, with NYSERDA. It's a dream team, and it's so exciting to have all this happening here in New York.
Yeah, and it's been assessed as a future over $1 trillion sector we're talking about here. So these moves are really, it's good climate policy, but this is real good economic development policy as well. Maya, who is a member of OpenAir and a Columbia Climate School student, asked a great question here, and I just want to sort of focus on that. Is that you want to learn more? Obviously, you can do that in the OpenAir community, but how is it that you also spread the word within your networks? And that's really what OpenAir is all about. We kind of jokingly say, keep your day job, because everybody who comes to OpenAir comes with their own network, their own job, their own setting that they're operating in. And so if you're a member of OpenAir and you're in our Discord, we'll talk to you. This very video right now that we're recording is going to go live on YouTube. And now the goal is to spread it as broadly as possible. So anybody who's listening to this who thinks, I think this is going to resonate in my network, in my community, and wants to get involved, this only works when we have a lot of people. So please look at the join link that we included, and we'll probably post again, and come on inside. And trust me, we'll get you going to work. There's lots of ways to contribute as an OpenAir advocate.
I answered briefly in the chat, but there was a follow-up question from Matt from NYSERDA about how, if at all, is technology stage factored into the multi-factor procurement scorecard. Early stage technologies that could be less expensive after significant deployment may be initially more expensive than the auction cap. And we definitely got that feedback from we did have a fixed auction cap initially, but we definitely got that feedback from early stage CDR companies. And the cap is now an average maximum to allow the department the flexibility to purchase more expensive early stage CDR projects. Another point there, really good feedback that we got from Nan Ranchahoff, who runs the procurement program at Stripe. We added scalability of the CDR pathway as a factor. So more highly scalable CDR pathways will get favored as opposed to pathways that have more limited scale. So, it's a really good question. And I'm not sure that we got the perfect solution, but it's pretty difficult to predict the future. And so we kind of just gave it our best shot.
Great. Well, I see that because we are at the hour that, many people were scheduled to jump off. One thing I just wanted to really emphasize is that I put the join link there again. Once you're inside, we can help navigate you to the work that we're doing here. And in fact, we do have a weekly standing call for our activists where we do planning and next steps and really get down to the nitty gritty of organizing. So folks who come in are welcome to participate in those. But the way to get that information to get started is to go ahead and click on that join link, come on inside, and we can start the conversation and your involvement in this effort. So Toby and Mega, did we have anything else we wanted to share? I think we covered a lot of ground there. This is just the beginning, but we look at this as sort of moment one, I think, and really mobilizing in New York and other states in a public way.
That's for me, but thanks to everyone who joined, and look forward to hopefully having some of you join in on the effort.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And please, thanks for coming today. And please do join OpenAir. And for those who are interested in the bill, we should have a published bill. I don't know how long these things take, but certainly within weeks, possibly within days. And so there will be a link online and a bill number in the assembly in the relatively near future. So we would love to get everyone's feedback on the policy as well, because there will be opportunity. The policy will be changed during the legislative process, and we're certainly going to be introducing it in other states. So like all good ideas are always welcome. So please join us, get involved, and we'd love to talk to you.
Thank you again so much, folks, and we will see you inside our Discord.